At the beginning of the millennium, video games changed forever. With the arrival of PS2, Gamecube and Xbox, gaming saw the biggest leap in technology yet, before entering the HD era a few years later with PS3 and Xbox 360. Even though trends have changed over time, this foundation shaped modern gaming and paved the way for future console generations with plenty of classics to boot. It's ironic, retro discourse often feels stuck on the same 8 to 64-bit milestones. Your Castlevania, Super Mario World, Half-Life or Zelda Ocarina of Time. Mind you, they all deserve their praise, but it's time to move on to the Y2K era and beyond, and pay respect to the new retro classics. 1 quarter into this century, it feels like a perfect time to throw my hat into the ring and recap what I consider the absolute 10 out of 10 games of this entire period. The titles from all the hundreds of games I finished that still astonish me today, because they showed the peak of game development and highlight the evolution gaming has seen in these decades. Now these picks are based on my personal experience. However, I feel strongly that these titles are timeless one way or the other. Really, this is about sharing recommendations and experiences, so I'd also be very interested in what you consider a 10 out of 10 in the comments down below. If you had to pin down one franchise that truly symbolizes changing trends and innovations in gaming over time, few series fit the bill as well as Resident Evil. In the 90s, it was the first series to make horror popular on a large scale. In 2002, a remake of the first game perfected the original survival horror formula with its eerie pre-rendered cinematography and where you had to plan out which battles to fight and which to avoid. That remake was a 10 out of 10 in itself, but since it was rooted in the 90s formula, I'm not counting it here. A few years later, the series would shake up the entire industry again with Resident Evil 4. Few games have ever been as well-rounded as the original version. It didn't just popularize third-person shooters with an over-the-shoulder view, it also delivered a campaign full of iconic moments, and it rarely loses tension over its 10 to 15 hour playtime. Some may find fault with the controls, you can't strafe or move while aiming, but that was deliberate. The combat encounters and enemy patterns were meticulously tuned so you can react just in time with your limited mobility and slow aiming. RE4 might be linear, but there's an enormous amount of secrets, from Easter eggs to new gameplay strategies. Even on my 8th playthrough, I might still find new details to appreciate. Also, when it came out, it featured mind-blowing graphics thanks to a very deliberate art direction. Plus, and here's a hot take, I still think that when it comes to its gothic fairy tale mood and ghost train-like backdrops, combined with a more striking soundtrack, the original version holds its own even after the remake. After shifting to multiplayer, RE5 gained even more mainstream popularity, but in my opinion the series lost its way with RE6 turning into a huge multiplayer action flick, probably aiming for the Call of Duty crowd that exploded on PS3 and Xbox 360. It ultimately wasn't sustainable, so Capcom did a 180 again and drastically scaled the series back to its more intimate horror roots. First with the VR-compatible RE7 and then with the remake of RE2, which would be the next 10 out of 10 in my book. This wasn't just a simple remaster, it was an entirely new take of old survival horror. By using the action camera of RE4, they had to come up with new balancing to make the smaller amount of slower zombies suspenseful again, which they actually pulled off. It features masterful level design, which always knows when to turn up the tension with encounters and when to lull you into a sense of safety. It perfectly creates horror through its interactivity and level design as a game, not through its storytelling. It's also a prime example of how investigation games should work. As convoluted as this weird facility full of abstruse puzzles might seem, the game doesn't need any elaborate hint systems or tutorials, because the exploration and the systems are completely intuitive. Shadow of the Colossus remains one of a kind. Its epic-sized battles against titans were often copied, but unlike those other titles, Colossus wasn't about the spectacle alone. After a single intro cutscene sets the mood, the game transports players into a seemingly abandoned land, where you need to find and slay multiple colossi. There aren't many tutorials, QTEs, or anything of the sort. Even during the battles, you always remain in full control of the character without any interruptions. Players have nothing at their disposal except for a dagger, a bow, and a horse, with the dagger pointing the way to the next colossus in this near silent landscape. It's an immersive experience which pretty much explains itself, and you need to use your wits to bring these colossi down. The map in between these battles is vast and empty, but it is so on purpose. The game creates a sense of isolation which always keeps a perfect balance between oppressiveness and a mesmerizing calm. Some people considered Colossus one of the first auteur games on PlayStation, and Sony even released it at one point in a so-called artistic games bundle. By the way, you are seeing footage from the PS4 remake. Sadly, the new team tinkered with the art direction, removing some of the ominous fog, which heightened its unusual fairy tale atmosphere. However, I always found the button layout and the lock-on in the old game irritating. While still not amazing, the PS4 remaster irons out many gameplay hiccups. In the remake, the game reached its full grandeur and became a certified 10 out of 10 that Sony should treat more prominently in its classics catalog. And at just 5 hours long, it's a game anyone should play at least once. Mario has been on the forefront of gaming innovation since the 80s. However, after the crazy success of retro throwbacks like New Super Mario Bros., Nintendo was playing it a little too safe with this series for multiple generations. After even Mario couldn't save the failed Wii U, Mario Odyssey felt like Nintendo wanted to prove the franchise was still fresh after all these decades. It was a game which felt ambitious and above all, not like something you already played. Now, because it's a little too far on the easy side and they still haven't figured out the perfect sandbox camera controls in my opinion, I wouldn't put Odyssey above some of the oldest Mario classics, but in this century, it's the definitive Mario experience in my book. Boasting creative sandbox platforming, a core mechanic that drastically changes Mario's moveset, and plenty of unpredictable set pieces. The main gameplay gimmick is the ability to transform into nearly every enemy type, so it radically increases the number of unique obstacles. Since the moveset of a chain chomp is different from that of a flying Goomba or a Mario fish. A few moves, like the long jump, aren't as smooth to activate as in prior games, but to compensate for that, the new extra cap bounce allows for a different kind of flexibility within these sandboxes. It's hard not to be engaged by its sheer amount of unique ideas and its brisk pace, as well as its tight sandbox design, which doesn't overstay its welcome. It has a big number of wholly unique locations full of different gameplay mechanics and gimmicks, while you never know where you might land next, be it a Jurassic Park, a Dragon's Lair, or Mario Manhattan. And the art direction always provides enough context to make each biome feel like an actual place, not just an obstacle course, just like an Odyssey. Arcade racers were a mainstay until the 2000s, but after the PS360 era, the genre sadly fizzled out and remaining franchises shifted to online open worlds. So as far as I'm concerned, Burnout 3 and 4 remain the pinnacle of linear racing, with a special shoutout to F-Zero GX. Either way, in Burnout there's no story to speak of, only straight up arcade racing action, with an emphasis on action. Burnout 3 Takedown introduced a new mechanic of the same name, which drastically increased the intensity of the high-speed traffic racing. You didn't just need to come in first place anymore, but also demolish your opponents to load up your nitro. Burnout 3 Takedown is by many considered the bigger classic, which is understandable, but to me the sequel, Burnout Revenge, was even more high adrenaline, by introducing even crazier elements into a race, like the ability to use smaller cars as ammunition against opponents, while also making the menus and campaign structure even more fast-paced, so you could start the action quicker. It's like being a kid smashing toy cars together or making the most ridiculous Fast and Furious movie. It's a glorious concept that I'll wholeheartedly recommend not only to racing fans, but even just action game fans in general. With Demon's Souls and then Dark Souls, developer From Software ushered in a new era of action role-playing games. Despite popular belief, Souls games are not about dull punishment. They are a literal interpretation of old-school dungeon crawling in real time. You need to carefully investigate hostile environments and use the tools at your disposal in smart ways, because the horror-inspired backdrops aren't just for show, they are part of a bigger survival concept where a certain amount of danger makes it come to life. Bloodborne would then represent the pinnacle of their craft on almost every level. You're thrust into a vast labyrinth teeming with deadly traps and countless secrets, inspired by gothic horror rather than dark fantasy, with nothing but a single clue telling you to escape this nightmare world called Yharnam. The combat is faster paced than usual and rewards aggression by letting you regain health through swift counterattacks. It features unparalleled level design, where anybody can find a way through this, at first glance, intimidating horror labyrinth. Visual cues masterfully lead your way, while at the same time it has so many secrets that each playthrough you learn something new. While you need to beware of monsters lurking in the shadows all the time. There might be some tough enemies during your investigations, but there always are alternative routes to follow, or tools for you to find to make your life against tough opponents easier, without any need for blatant hint systems, because it all feels intuitive. Apart from that, the game also features an amazing art direction where no alley feels the same. These eerie backdrops, from graveyards, witch houses, haunted castles, creepy forests, are everything a horror fan could wish for. As much as I appreciate the era of PS2, Gamecube and Xbox, one downside was the fact that side-scrollers and 2D games were relegated to the sidelines for over a decade. 3D was the new thing, until indie developers had first breakthroughs on Xbox Live Arcade with throwbacks like Meat Boy or experimental platformers like Limbo. On the other hand, it was the Nintendo Wii with its successful retro Mario games that reintroduced the idea that traditional 2D platforming games could be full-fledged console experiences. Rayman Origins and Legends would then up the ante and boast incredibly fluid controls, which made for my favorite gameplay feel in a side-scroller ever. Depending on the day, maybe Rayman would be a 10 out of 10 for me too. But I'd argue that both of these trends, the rise of indie throwbacks and the return of mascot platformers, culminated with Sonic Mania. This wasn't just a typical mascot revival. Some of the most talented indie developers and series fans joined forces with the official Sonic team to create the ultimate retro platformer. Sonic didn't have it easy after the 90s, being responsible for some of the most infamous critical flops. And some people will never get used to the pinball nature of the franchise's unique gameplay, or simply don't want to. Ignoring that side of things, this collaboration refined the core of Sonic's fast-paced action platforming to perfection, taking old level mechanics and building on top of them, creating a firework of constant gameplay surprises. Not to mention that unlike many indie pixel games, Sonic Mania truly looks and sounds like a lost 32-bit Sonic game, thanks to masterful sprite work and pixel pop. It's so well done that even the special stages are good, a rarity in Sonic games. Sonic Mania is a game, whenever I start a replay, I can't help but to finish the entire thing in one session, because it just never stops with its new ideas. Now for something more offbeat, the original Nier game, in particular the western version called Nier Gestalt. Yes, this financial failure with ugly graphics and a 6 on Metacritic is to me a misunderstood 10 out of 10. It's an action RPG that fully embraces the medium to tell its story. On an Earth with only daylight, where the last of humanity is terrorized by weird shades, you go out on a quest to return your daughter from the so-called Shadow Lord, accompanied by a bizarre cast of characters and misfits like a talking tome, a weird depressed puppet who's also a walking nuclear weapon, and a profane huntress, which at the same time is accompanied by a mesmerizing soundtrack, which is all sung in an alien-sounding fantasy language. I won't go into spoilers, but what elevates the game is the narrative structure. Nier uses mechanics that people are familiar with from New Game Plus mode to highlight the absolute violence that all of this conflict creates, but without resorting to a cheap black and white narrative. This isn't a plot that could have been told in a different format. The full impact is entirely woven into its structure as a video game. The biggest hot take, even for many fans, will be that I actually also consider the moment-to-moment gameplay very good. It starts out button mashy, but the action combat is more than sufficient. At the same time, Nier is also a celebration of all gaming, which will switch from action RPG to visual novel or platformer. Many developers failed whenever they try to stray away from their core gameplay, but in Nier, almost all of it works. The reason why I prefer Nier Gestalt is that they've changed the protagonist from a typical anime teenage boy to an ugly dad character to supposedly appeal to Western audiences. Arguably, this was a pretty ham-fisted attempt, but ultimately, intended or not, the rough look of the main character only makes the game even more bizarre, which in this case is a good thing. As the era of Xbox Live Arcade opened the floodgates for indie developers, Microsoft themselves would also often land their hands in some promising projects. For many years then, Xbox teased Cuphead, a supposed old-school platformer where the main appeal was its distinct visual style. In reality, it was entirely its own thing. As a beautifully animated boss rush game, its most obvious influence was the early 20th century cartoon aesthetic, while for its gameplay it took notes from 16-bit classics from studios like Konami. But it wasn't just a copy like some other retro throwbacks. The way it combined these elements, it created its very own world and game dynamics. The intense 1 vs 1 battle arenas mixed with platforming obstacles might have some reminiscence to a few 16-bit games, but it also plays unlike any of them. And the aesthetic isn't just a copy of certain cartoons, the vibes are very unique to this title. The game is tough as nails, but like the biggest classics of the past, such as Contra, it's a game you love to master. Nintendo's old Metroid concept, in which you conquer 2D labyrinths by gaining new abilities, which open up earlier paths on the map, gained an all-new life thanks to indie developers in the 2010s and beyond. However, very few attempts at adapting this style of game design into 3D have been as profound as Nintendo's own Metroid Prime. It might have not had the same influence that Zelda Ocarina of Time had before it on the 3D action-adventure genre, but for many who played it at launch, it had a similar impact. Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto had the Texas-based Nintendo newcomers Retro Studios create a decelerated and much more immersive take on the formula, which thanks to a faithful remaster on the Switch is more accessible than ever. Once again, Nintendo's bounty hunter Samus crashes on a deserted planet that players must conquer using their wits. Back then, the new tech of the Gamecube allowed for much more sophisticated world building, be it by creating these graphical effects on the character's visor or using tricks like hiding loading times behind door animations to make the world feel seamless. The scanning mechanic was also ingenious, as players used the visor to collect information about the world and organically solve environmental puzzles. No part of the exploration feels artificial. Don't be mistaken, Metroid Prime is not a typical shooter. Constant action is not the core of the game, which is why battles work with a target lock-on similar to Zelda. Much more important is the careful investigation of the alien terrain. There is some parkour to test your jumping skills, but more often you'll analyze anomalies in the surroundings using your spacesuit's various scan functions and abilities. The board computer provides hints, but they fit naturally into the scanning gameplay instead of feeling like artificial handholding. And obstacles like water or darkness feel like natural parts of the world rather than mere upgrade barriers. Rarely has it been so intuitive and immersive to explore ancient temples, sunken ships, and fallen sanctuaries. On top of that, Metroid Prime has one of the best soundtracks in gaming, perfectly capturing the feeling of isolation and the extraterrestrial. Metroid Prime never achieved huge mainstream success, but among fans it rightfully remains a milestone for immersive gameplay. Thanks to a wholly new level of character flexibility, the era of PS2 quickly brought a new type of hack and slash with fast acrobatics, first introduced by Devil May Cry. I gotta be real, even though it's among my favorite genres, there wasn't ever one title I would consider a flawless 10 out of 10. However, there's one title that might not be my favorite, and which has flaws. So kind of an honorable mention, but that I still feel the most confident in recommending as a must play, which is Metal Gear Rising. Because this game is what a proper action game should strive for. Not only does it fulfill the dream of taking control of a cyborg ninja, but also boasts some of the most over-the-top action of its time, thanks to tight gameplay, edgy attitude, a sick art direction, and not many redundancies in its 6-hour campaign. After series inventor Hideo Kojima got nowhere with the prototype he built around his character Raiden, Platinum Games was able to turn this concept into a full-fledged action game thanks to an intuitive parry system and the ability to slice enemies and objects apart with finesse. It's relatively simple but effective, with sick-looking cyborgs and robots which are a joy to maltreat. It also features a typical Metal Gear style plot where anime villains control US politics.
The Patriots, they knew war was good for the economy. The memes.
To do the action justice, it's somehow even more insane than the Kojima games before it, culminating in the iconic final boss fight against a corrupt senator powered by nanomachines. Then there's an over-the-top butt rock soundtrack, which becomes more intense as the boss fights go on. In any other medium, people would consider the music or the story to be cringe, but with the wonders of interactivity, here it becomes hype. And that's the end for now. There are obviously many more titles to potentially talk about, but at this point I feel pretty confident in these choices that really highlight what made gaming so good in the past few generations. If you've made it this far, again, I'm interested to read about your defining game experiences too. And if you found any of this babbling interesting, why not recommend the video so others can chime in too? Either way, thanks for watching.